After a lot of research, the consolidation of vast amounts of information, and several hours of work, it is finally done. What you see here is the first in an upcoming series of videos covering all of the factions in Elden Ring, with the goal of visualizing the structure as well as the connections between all members of a faction in order to fully understand how the many different NPCs, enemies, and bosses are all connected to one another via their lore. And as a bonus, you can have this depiction of the Mohgwyn Dynasty and all future diagrams of every Elden Ring faction for yourself. Whether you want it just for your own personal needs or are a fellow content creator and wish to use it for your own YouTube videos. Though if you use it in your own videos, then at the very least, show some courtesy and credit me for my work. You can find a link to this diagram in the video description. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive into the Mohgwyn Dynasty. To understand this faction, we first have to talk about its name, Mohgwyn Dynasty. The term dynasty originates from the Greek word dynastes, meaning lord or ruler. The word is most commonly used when referring to a sequence of rulers or leaders who belong to the same family, where the leadership position is often passed down from one generation to the next, meaning the division for this faction is to be a permanent powerhouse in the lands between. On the other hand, Mohgwyn is a word that is combining the terms Mohg and Wyn. Mohg doesn't hold any meaning other than referring to the omen Mohg. However, the term Wyn does carry some meaning in its original language, being Welsh. In its Welsh origin, it can mean fair, white, or blessed. Wyn is a common element in Welsh names and words that is often associated with positive attributes. So, combined together, Mohgwyn means blessed Mohg, which in context of Mohg's lore makes a lot of sense. In fact, we can pinpoint the moment that made him believed to be blessed, that being his encounter with the Formless Mother deep underground. An encounter where the Formless Mother sensed his accursed omen blood and made it erupt into a flame of blood. A highly formative event for Mohg, since for probably the first time in his life, he wasn't detested for his omen heritage like he experienced from the Golden Order. Instead, by the quote-unquote love the Formless Mother showed him during that meeting, he came to the realization that his blood isn't a curse, but a blessing. An idea contrasting Morgoth's view of their shared blood, who firmly believe that their blood is a curse, a stain on the brilliant Golden Order their parents created. As a result, this encounter with the Formless Mother, be it by chance or design, is the beginning of the Mohgwyn Dynasty, a vision of Mohg in which he sought to share his quote-unquote blessed, accursed blood with others. Motivated by the belief that omen blood, especially his own, is not a curse as condemned by the Golden Order, but a blessing he has to share with others so that they too can experience the love the Formless Mother showed him. And by sharing his blood, Mohg created the horrifying scene that is Mohgwyn Palace. For it is here that we can see what the sharing of his blood does to others. Which brings us to the first layer of the Mohgwyn Dynasty. In what I refer to as the pawns of the dynasty, this layer encompasses the majority of the creatures that constitute the backbone of Mohg's army and the military base of his faction. Their primary role is to serve as foot soldiers in large numbers, enabling the dynasty to stand their ground against the forces of the other factions across the lands between. They consist of the Red Albinoics, the Bloodhounds, and the mutated giant crows we find around the palace in the Blood Swarm, as well as the ghoulish corpses who are at the basis of the palace. As I already mentioned, they are simple soldiers to boost the dynasty's fighting power. So, at first glance, they aren't interesting in the slightest. However, have you ever asked yourself why the Albinoics at the palace have a red skin and omen-like horns protruding from their heads? Or why the creatures have blood-like clumps all across their bodies and can inflict bleed damage? While these enemies are unremarkable gameplay-wise, they offer us a great insight into what the consequences are of Mohg sharing his quote-unquote blessed accursed blood with others, and how Mohg envisions the coming age of his dynasty will look like should he ever convert Miquella to his cause. For it is his accursed blood infused into all of these beings, forcing them to undergo a metamorphosis. This process is exemplified by the transformation of white Albinoics into red ones, who are unique to this specific region of the game. When entering the palace via the portal located in the consecrated snowfields, the first scene we come across here are these Albinoics sitting around the edge with 4 red Albinoics standing guard. Whether these white ones are here of their own free will or were captured and enslaved by the dynasty is up for interpretation. When looking at this scene found within Liurnia, near the Church of Rose, it is very likely that the dynasty attracts them naturally. After all, Mohg shows love to everyone joining his cult, dynasty, with the desire to bestow his blessed blood onto everyone to show his boundless love. And since the Albinoics aren't even seen as living beings due to their artificial origin, it isn't surprising that they flock to factions like Miquella or the Dynasty, since these places show them compassion and respect instead of the slaughter, torture, and mass murder they encounter everywhere else in the lands between. Although the way in which the Dynasty treats them isn't that much better when we take a look as to how they turn them into the Dynasty's red soldiers. The precise steps remain elusive to us, but when looking at the blood swarm closely, it is quite a cool process. In multiple locations, we can find the corpses of countless white Albinoics. I presume that killing and bathing their corpses in this blood swarm is the process in which the accursed blood of Mohg merges with their body and transforms them into the red Albinoics. Evidence for my theory being that close to a pile of Albinoic corpses, we can find red Albinoics submerged close to them. As such, the process of them merging with Mohg's omen blood can be seen as a form of baptism, resulting in their skin turning red and receiving some omen-like features, which in all likelihood is how the other blood creatures we find at the palace are created as well. A baptism and a forceful act of love reveal to us that we're dealing here with nothing else than a cult. A cult that builds its foundation on slaughtering its recruits, whether they voluntarily or are forced to join them by their own kin. You know, I really pity the poor Albinoics. It seems they never catch a break from mass slaughter, even when being embraced by such a loving cult. I really wonder why. Alright! We all have to use the same method to get stronger! At any rate, the lowest level of this cult should give you a good insight into its nature and the ultimate vision Mohg wants to engulf the entire lands between in. Every corner of the land being embraced and affected by his quote-unquote blessed blood. But this brings us to the question as to how Mohg was capable of using his blood to create such abominations. And the answer to that are the very first people he abducted and indoctrinated into his cult. The war surgeons, who became the first key personnel for the advancement of his dynasty. Right after his encounter with the Formless Mother, Mohg must have begun forming the vision of how his dynasty should be, what kind of values it should possess and how to spread its influence throughout the land. And to venerate his outer god, the Formless Mother, Mohg knew that his accursed blood, which was blessed by his god, had to be at the center of it, which naturally only meant that he had to fully understand and unravel the powers of his own blood, as well as finding a way to effectively share it with others so that they too would understand the love shown to him by the Formless Mother. Naturally, Mohg needed someone who isn't just knowledgeable about blood in general, but also how to administer bloodletting and blood transfusions. And the only people in all of the lands between with such knowledge are the war surgeons on the battlefield of the Shattering Wars. A chaotic war Mohg exploited to abduct a total of 4 surgeons, we at least know of, without raising any suspicions amidst the turmoil of war. Through this act, and to convince them to join him, he transfused some of his blood into them. As we learn through the item description of the White Mask, the Lord of Blood's curse enlivens the wearer when bloodletting occurs. A cursed outcome of receiving Mohg's accursed blood, which drove them to perpetually seek the euphoria that the act of spilling blood provides. It explains as to why we can find 3 of them amidst the blood swarm, where the accursed blood is flowing endlessly. As such, it is the perfect place for them to indulge in the drug-like effect they feel when blood is flowing around them. Though those 3 weren't any use to Mohg in this state. Yet as we learn via the war surgeon gown, of the surgeons that were abducted by the Lord of Blood, none were able to tame the accursed blood. None but Varré, that is, though he was an exception. Varré didn't succumb to the urge to witness the constant flow of blood like his comrades. Instead, his body managed to strike a symbiosis with the accursed blood of Mohg and not let its effect cloud his mind. Something Mohg had hoped for, since Varré is by far the most important person within the dynasty for just one reason. Together with Mohg, Varré was capable of understanding his own blood and researched numerous ways in which it can be utilized by the dynasty. The infusion of the omen blood into other creatures to form an army, the utilization of blood and blood flame in incantations which would be utilized by the future knights and priests of the dynasty, and most important of all, how the blood can be transfused into other people and prevented from consuming their mind, like what happened to the other war surgeons, which eventually led to the formation of the Pureblood Knights, or the Bloody Fingers as they are also known. As such, Varré became the right-hand man of Mohg and probably the biggest contributor to the rapid growth of the Mohgwyn Dynasty, which is why Varré should be viewed as the head of the blood research team, consisting of himself and the other 3 surgeons under his command. With their location within the blood swarm, they possibly monitor and collect data on how different organisms react and evolve via the exposure and transfusion of Mohg's blood. Whilst Varré travels throughout the lands between to anoint more people, and particularly tarnished, to the cause of the Mohgwyn Dynasty, which isn't just to rule over the lands between, but to also raise their divinity to full godhood. Now, I don't want to talk about Miquella just yet, but he's the main reason as to why the dynasty created and used their Pureblood Knights to slay countless people throughout the lands between. We cannot be certain as to when or why exactly Miquella was abducted by Mohg. The game's timeline, nor the lore offers a concrete enough point, nor what Miquella's purpose in the dynasty would be. However, their goal to raise Miquella to full godhood can only be achieved by infusing him with more blood than Mohg alone can donate. Because as Mohg's remembrance states, no matter how much of his bloody bedchamber he tried to share, he received no response from the young Empyrean. He tried to communicate with Miquella, who is still slumbering in his cocoon, but to no avail. And to accelerate the process of Miquella's metamorphosis, Mohg, together with the help of Varré's knowledge about blood, came to the conclusion that feeding the cocoon with blood might help to speed up this process, presenting them with the problem that in the early stages of the dynasty, Mohg alone couldn't supply the cocoon with enough blood to awaken Miquella. So he needed others in order to achieve this goal, which, I assume, is when he met Okina, a man that had renounced anything else in the world other than his pursuit of honing his skill through a life as a sword demon seeking opponents forevermore. And one opponent Okina found was Mohg, who felt Okina's blade, rivers of blood, on his very flesh. Containing the lust and madness for blood, Mohg realized in that moment that Okina was perfect in aiding him and Varré in feeding Miquella's cocoon with blood. After all, the swordsmen of Righ are familiar with how powerful their attacks can become when being imbued with blood. As such, the heights of the powers Okina would achieve if he joined Mohg were too tempting for him to reject. That is why he accepted Mohg's offer to live as a demon, received his accursed blood through Varré's administration, and became possibly the first bloody finger the lands between have seen up to this point, so that Okina could indulge in endless battles to hone his skills, and Mohg receiving the blood of Okina's victims for Miquella's cocoon. And this is how and why the Bloody Fingers, or Pureblood Knights, whatever you prefer, were formed within the dynasty in the first place. As for why each knight's finger gets infused with Mohg's accursed blood stems from the power it grants its user. Plus, just infusing them with such little amounts of blood might prevent them to lose their sanity like the war surgeons did. For Mohg's blood allows the Bloody Fingers to use one of Mohg's abilities, that being fast traveling and emerging from blood throughout the lands. This ability not only allows them to stalk the blood-soaked fields of the lands between in order to quickly find and confront their victims, but also speeds up the rate at which the victim's blood is offered up to Mohg and Miquella's cocoon. And it also explains why we can use our Bloody Finger to invade the world of other players how often we want to. This right also explains as to why within a dynasty, Bloody Fingers are called Pureblood Knights. It's because they receive the quote-unquote blessed and powerful blood from Mohg through Varré's anointment ritual, merging together with their own blood and possibly even dominating it in the long term. Which is another reason as to why I position Varré above any Pureblood Knight within the structure, because he is something of a godfather to every knight of the dynasty, due to him granting each their Bloody Finger and inducting them as such into the Mohgwyn cult through this ritual. A ritual which is, in a sense, similar to the baptism within Christianity. Plus, Varré possibly gifted them, next to the finger, also blood incantations like Blood Flame Blade, Swarm of Flies, and Bloody Slash, among others. This is pure speculation on my part, but Varré potentially helped Mohg in the creation of incantations related to blood and blood flame. It would explain how Bloody Fingers and other members of the dynasty got their hands on such incantations, for which a prayer book doesn't exist. Within each of their item descriptions, you can find a mention that these were either shared or granted by Mohg, the Lord of Blood. While it is possible that through communion with the Formless Mother, Mohg alone discovered or even created these incantations, it doesn't explain as to how they were distributed among his followers. After all, the item description of the Pureblood Knights medal each knight receives from Varré states that it can be used to be granted audience with Mohg, only it is not yet time, for Mohg yet slumbers besides the divinity. As such, no dynasty member ever met Mohg, their leader, with Okina, Varré, and the war surgeons being the only exceptions we know of. And the only way in which these incantations could have been spread among the dynasty's followers is through Mohg's right-hand man Varré. Or maybe through the religious group within the dynasty we turn our attention to in just a bit. Before wrapping up the Pureblood Knights, there's one last aspect I wish to discuss. It is how you can remove yourself from the dynasty and the ranks of the knights by cutting off your own bloody finger. An act committed by Yura, who was a Pureblood Knight once alongside Eleanor. As we learn from him in his final moments, he says,
"I've sliced the finger off. Please. Please, Eleanor. Yield to the cessplant no longer."
Confirming that both of them joined the dynasty in the past. We don't learn about the reasons for them accepting Varré's invitation into the ranks, but we can assume that they wanted to obtain more power, based on them partaking in direct communion, which is inherently linked with the desire to obtain great power. And as to why Yura at one point decided to leave the dynasty and instead dedicate his life to hunt down Eleanor and other bloody fingers is again something we cannot answer. Just like how effective his method of cutting off his own finger actually is. Because remember, the blood Mohg shares with his followers irreversibly changes them forever, as we've looked at previously. And the blood could still affect Yura. It would explain the dialogue from him after defeating the Raven Mount Bloody Finger.
"Wretched worms, leave me be."
But this could also be Shabriri slowly closing in onto Yura here, so you could also interpret his dialogue in that way. At any rate, the accursed blood Mohg is sharing with his followers is undeniably changing them in significant ways, and the followers undergoing the most severe changes can be found among his noble ranks. Bringing us to the last group, other than the leaders, of the Mohgwyn Dynasty I haven't talked about yet. The religious clergy consisting of the sanguine nobles and blood priests like Esker. The position of the nobles within the dynasty is easy to understand when reading the item description of the sanguine noble hood. Hood of dyed black cloth featuring gold embroidery, worn by the nobles who serve the Lord of Blood. Known to strike from pools of blood, these assassins are missionaries come to share the gospel of accursed blood. Contrasting the Pureblood Knights' approach to open confrontations and fights, the sanguine nobles prefer a more subtle and deadlier approach to encounters on their missionary expeditions should it be unavoidable. Yet, what tasks do their roles as missionaries entail? And why exactly would they become nobles after the inauguration of the Mohgwyn Dynasty? To begin to understand them, we first have to take a look at their name and more particularly the term sanguine. The term sanguine comes from the Latin word sanguinus, meaning of blood, which in turn is derived from sanguis, meaning blood. As a result, they are referred to as nobles of blood, a title holding the answer to their status as nobility as well as their appearance, or rather their lack thereof. While they possess a visible physical body that is covered with the most common features out of anyone within the dynasty, other than Mohg, their faces on the other hand are invisible, something most certainly caused by having received the most of Mohg's accursed blood, which not only made them taller and gave them the horns of an omen, but also closer in nature to the Formless Mother, the god of this dynasty. This not only marks them as the most devoted followers of the dynasty, but also places them under the direct command of Mohg. Since they are the closest to Mohg in terms of utilizing the Formless Mother's powers that the accursed blood grants them, as is the case of them effortlessly residing and emerging from a pool of blood like Mohg himself is capable of. Yet all of their progress can be traced back to Varré's contributions to the study and appliance of Mohg's accursed blood, which in turn positions them slightly below Varré, because it is most likely through him that they are created from the ranks of the blood priests in the first place. With Esker, who we find within Leyndell's catacombs, being the only mention of this rank throughout the entire game. Hold up a second, you might think. Why do I say that the Sanguine Nobles are created from blood priests like Esker? Well, because of their role's description as blood missionaries. The term missionary is an expression for a priest traveling throughout the world with the mission to spread their religious beliefs in other regions. While priests, on the other hand, are assigned to a specific area in order to preach the teachings of their religion. Which is why we find Esker within Leyndell's catacombs, since it is the birthplace of their religion. Because the Sanguine Nobles and the Blood Priests are the only religiously named roles within the entire dynasty, it is as such logical for these distinct groups to be associated with one another within the dynasty. In fact, I would even go so far to say that the Blood Priests give us the explanation as to how and why the Sanguine Nobles are created in the first place. For if Blood Priests commit enough acts to prove their unyielding faith in the Formless Mother and Mohg, they are rewarded with more accursed blood, which in turn transforms them into a Sanguine Noble, representing a visible confirmation of their faith into Mohg and the Formless Mother. Something backed up through Esker, Nerechus, and the Invader right before the portal leading to Mohgwyn Palace, who all wear the same attire as the Sanguine Nobles. This marks them as to be nobles of the coming Mohgwyn Dynasty. Yet they aren't as transfigured like the partially invisible Sanguine Nobles, a discrepancy that has to be related to the amounts of accursed blood they have received so far. For receiving Mohg's blood is, after all, the highest reward within the dynasty and what gives its members their power. Since the more blood they receive, they naturally become more powerful. As we can see, for example, with the Sanguine Noble's ability to travel and reside effortlessly within blood. As such, in order to climb the ranks of the dynasty and to become more powerful, one has to prove their faith in Mohg and the Formless Mother. An act explained to us by what the Lord of Blood's exaltation talisman, dropped by Esker, can tell us. Render up your offerings of blood to your Lord. Drench my consort's chamber. Slake his cause first. His awakening shall herald the dawn of our dynasty. The more blood an individual spills within the name of the dynasty to nurture Miquella's core, the more powerful they become and the better the position they attain. As such, you could make the point of entering the dynasty as a knight, advancing to the position of a blood priest, and ultimately transforming into a Sanguine Noble is the intended progression for the most faithful followers of Mohg and the Formless Mother. After all, Nerechus, who is a bloody finger as we learned through Yura, wears the attire of a Sanguine Noble. As a result, we could have been the final kill he required to advance to the position of a blood priest or even a noble. Though in the end, we cut his career short within the dynasty, and even replace him should we choose to join the dynasty. Now then, after all of this, you can probably see how big, well-organized and powerful the Mohgwyn Dynasty is. They cannot be simply dismissed as the mere mad ravings of lunatics, as Gideon is prone to describe them. Although definitely a cult, they are one of the biggest threats the lands between would have to face should they succeed in awakening Miquella from his core and begin their descent in full force onto the land. Which brings us now to the final part of the dynasty, its leaders. Starting off with Mohg, who wishes to raise Miquella to full godhood and act as his consort. Within the dynasty, he proclaimed for himself the title of Luminary. The term Luminary originates from the Latin word luminarum, which is derived from lumen, meaning light. The "ari" suffix often implies something relating to or connected with. So, Luminary essentially refers to something related to light, which is a fitting title for Mohg. After all, only after his encounter with the Formless Mother in the dark depths of Leyndell's underground area did Mohg learn to love his own heritage and accursed blood, and not see it as a revolting defilement under the teachings of the Golden Order. It was then and there that for the first time in his life, he was shown actual love and the powers his blood contains. And through this revelation, Mohg began to show others this light as well. Just as the Formless Mother enveloped him in love, he too now desires to extend that same affection to others, so that they can also bask in the same enlightenment Mohg received from the Formless Mother, whether they willingly embrace this twisted form of love or have to be forced to accept it. All have to be embraced by his love and love him in turn. That is the core driving desire behind Mohg's actions. As such, due to the neglect from Mohg's and Morgoth's mother Marika, Mohg just wants to be accepted and loved by someone else. which in turn explains why Mohg is so obsessed with Miquella, who is a character that is respected and beloved by literally anyone in the lands between. It is very likely that Mohg abducted Miquella in hope of receiving the friendship and love from him he never experienced his entire life, and also to convince the young Empyrean to use his gift of garnering and compelling the affections of everyone else to convert them to followers of Mohg's dynasty, so that people would willingly join the dynasty and can bask in the love of the Formless Mother, instead of having to abduct and force them to join him, like it was the case with Varré, the other war surgeons, possibly the Albinoics, and anyone else the dynasty got their hands on. At least that is what I believe to be Mohg's intentions behind the abduction of Miquella. There isn't really much to go on when it comes to understanding the intentions behind Mohg abducting Miquella or what he wants Miquella to do, since Miquella's story still has to be told in Shadow of the Erdtree. We can only speculate about Miquella's intentions and how Mohg affected these, which I have already done in a separate video. In this video, I explain as to why his character is literally that of Griffith in Berserk, which I would recommend you to check out after this one. Due to the sheer amount of similarities between both characters, I was able to draw parallels between the actions and motivations of Griffith and Miquella in order to get a better grasp at Miquella's goals and motivations, and whether the influence of Mohg and the Formless Mother on Miquella will drive him to become an evil, godlike entity like Griffith became through the manipulations of the God-Hand from Berserk. As such, turning Miquella into an evil god the Formless Mother could possess in order to spread her influence and will, like the Greater Will does with Marika in the lands between, is certainly plausible, because even though officially Miquella is viewed as the god of the Mohgwyn Dynasty, in truth it is the Formless Mother that this dynasty worships and serves, and her vision for the lands between can be glimpsed at in Mohgwyn Palace, which is a world covered in blood, transforming any living organism through its accursed blood, and ultimately a world that is ruled by defiled blood. Though why exactly the Formless Mother demands runes, is obsessed with blood, particularly the accursed blood of Mohg, as well as her ultimate vision for the lands between, isn't something we are meant to understand. Nor her and Mohg's designs for Miquella, since we still have a big chunk of the game's lore to explore and discover in Shadow of the Erdtree. Regardless, after seeing the dynasty through my depiction, its customs, blood research, and followers' actions, I hope that you have come to fully understand them, and are perfectly prepared with the necessary knowledge to see Miquella's fate in Shadow of the Erdtree. If you have enjoyed this video, then leave a like and consider to subscribe to my channel. I'll do this kind of format for all of the factions in Elden Ring, and a couple of days after the upload of this video, you can vote on a community post about the next faction you want to see visualized like the Mohgwyn Dynasty. Don't forget that you can download this diagram from the link in the video description, as well as using it in your own YouTube video, so long as you simply credit me as its original creator. And maybe check out my video about why Miquella is Griffith while you wait for the next faction video. Anyway, I hope you have a great day ahead of you, and see you next time. Ciao!